Okay, so I want to do a real brief, like, what do you need to know about Aristotle to help you with this section? So for the most part, the author is looking at Aristotle's On Rhetoric or The Art of Rhetoric. But you'll see throughout the definitions, like how Aristotle defines rhetoric and like what the ideas are for all of this are pulled from multiple works that we've seen that have survived. And this one's really important. And, we have an entire chapter on kind of the sophists, Plato and now Aristotle, because these are foundational to, and you'll see this, all of the other conceptions of rhetoric. So a little bit, like, what do you need to know about Aristotle? Because his definition of rhetoric is the most famous. So first you need to know his definition. So it's the art of seeing the available means of persuasion in any given situation. And we need to remember, and use a slightly different terminology, and depending on who is translating the Greek, parts of that are translated slightly differently. This is still about invention. So we could say seeing the available means of persuasion in any given situation as from the audience perspective, analyzing or critiquing, not a part of rhetoric. Like we've got thousands of years before we are thinking in those terms. We're not there yet. We're still on the invention side. We're still on the, like, what do I use to put together an argument? What do I need to practice? What do students need to practice? Aristotle's big contribution are ethos, pathos, and logos. We're going to see these a lot. The big one is, so ethos, and this chapter spends a lot of time on ethos because it's like surprisingly complicated. It's not just the authority or the credibility of the speaker. It's a much more complicated and rich understanding of a mode of persuasion than just the credibility, even though it's often just translated as credibility. There's so much more to it. This chapter goes into it. This chapter goes into logos and pathos a little bit, but not as much. So pathos are emotional appeals, but it's really important to know, especially for Aristotle, that an emotional appeal is not just, it needs to have an end. So when Aristotle defined pathos associated with that mode of persuasion, he also defined catharsis. To be effective in moving people towards persuasion or moving understanding, there also needs to be like a, what do I do with this? What do I do with these emotions now that they've come up? And I would say when we look at, so let's say we look at, and a former grad student colleague of mine is trying to write a book on Hitler's rhetoric. Like, Hitler was a very effective rhetorician. The catharsis and like where that emotional appeal was directed, or when it wasn't directed, what people chose to do with it is a part of the problem. It's a part of where, even though Aristotle is not talking about critique, there are a lot of ways we can use Aristotle's invention to say the decisions that were being made rhetorically were lacking what we would probably consider to be catharsis. And that's where we saw some of the dangerous rhetoric that we saw because of that. And those are the kinds of connections that we can make. We're not using this to critique, we're making this to understand the decisions that are available in specific situations. And so I do want to point out with pathos, something that sometimes, not even sometimes, it's often left out, is Aristotle did include this idea of catharsis and like, where do we direct this? Kairos, so K-A-I-R-O-S, and the idea of timing. So it's not just any situation, but it's any situation in a given time. There are certain arguments that are available at certain times. So it's the weather's getting warm here. I'm making this about probably, depending on how quick you are through the class, about a week before you're gonna actually supposed to watch this video. The weather in Lancaster County is getting warm. Wherever you are, I'm assuming it's getting warm as well. If I start talking about pumpkin spice lattes, you're like, why? It's June. Like, what are you talking about? That's a conversation for a different time. But if I were talking about pumpkin spice lattes in like mid-October into November, like the timing makes more sense and the arguments resonate better. They are more effective because timing with all of that. So like ethos, pathos, and logos don't just stand by themselves. They're also interconnected to all of these other pieces, and they're interconnected with each other. And then the last one is logos, and logos is really important for all of this because what we see in the Middle Ages is that logos definition is changed. I mean, this is how foundational it is. You're going to see it when we start talking about Roman rhetoric. And then as Rome kind of falls apart and we go into the little individual, like oligarchies that we see in the Middle Ages, the church has a lot of room, the church being predominantly the Catholic Church at the time, or what became eventually the Catholic Church, redefined logos from logic to the Word of God. And that's really important and really powerful for then who has the authority. So modes of persuasion ultimately become who has the authority to speak over all of these ideas. So it's really important to understand with Aristotle, his basic definition. Modes of persuasion are one of his biggest contributions, and then the topics. So there is a second standalone piece, and I talk about this at the very beginning of the chapter, and it's called A Brief Outline of Rhetoric, of ancient rhetoric. Sorry, I forgot the ancient part. So this talks about the parts of rhetoric with the invention, arrangement, style. We're going to talk about that later because those are the canons of rhetoric. The big one for this, it goes through deliberative, judicial, and demonstrative as the types of speeches, which are foundational to Aristotle. He's really defining these categories. Talks about the modes of persuasion, which we just talked about, and then it starts listing the topics. And I will link to a couple different places where you can find those so you can look through them. But that is then what future rhetoricians, especially in Rome, reinvent or change a little bit to meet the culture at the time. So what we start to see with Aristotle is this foundation for here is rhetorical theory and here's how to teach rhetoric. And so at this point, it's pretty much assumed. We're not positive that Aristotle actually wrote on rhetoric. It is likely that these are notes that students took in his class or notes that he used to put together a lecture. It's definitely very specifically handbooky. Like On Rhetoric is a textbook to a huge extent. It is a textbook, it is a practice guide. He has other works that are more theoretical and philosophical, really blending those two ideas so that we've got kind of a convergence of where we're developing rhetorical theory and where we're developing a pedagogy of rhetorical theory. And so what's really interesting, and we're going to get into this even more, is teasing apart the theory from the pedagogy does become difficult and parts of it are conflated, but that pedagogy is a central conversation surrounding rhetoric from ancient Greek times until now. And that's really important. That's a huge, sometimes overlooked contribution that we really start to see cemented with Aristotle. It existed before. Plato created the school and Aristotle went to Plato's school. And then Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander the Great. Like, we're pretty sure that Alexander the Great was in classes with Aristotle as his teacher. It's actually depicted in the movie with Colin Farrell. Aristotle's the teacher in that. Fun fact. So I think those are kind of the basics you need to know about Aristotle so we can get into his definition of rhetoric.